The ultimate dream of any Elder Scrolls fanboy is to one day create their own mod within their favorite Elder Scrolls property. Way back when I first got my hands on Morrowind as but a wee lad, I was enamored with its mod building tool, the construction kit. I would spend many a day dabbling with mechanics, trying to see what I could accomplish with such godly power. But I did have one major drawback. I was a moron. By the time Oblivion rolled around, I was certainly older, more worldly, but just as stupid as always. And as for Skyrim, well, I got the Xbox 360 version, so I was fucked on that front. But now, accessed with unending knowledge of the World Wide Web and ADHD medication, I am finally ready to do what I was always destined to do. Make some garbage for the internet. You see, the Elder Scrolls is often heralded as the ultimate RPG experience, but in terms of the proper RPG genre, it's more of the bastard child of RPG parents raised to be the ultimate mishmash cool kid with a severe case of identity crisis. And that's really too bad, because when it comes to the classic CRPG, the Elder Scrolls would make for the perfect setting. But it seems that Bethesda isn't interested in making a game that 99% of gamers would never play, so I guess I'll just have to do it myself. And the perfect candidate is Morrowind. But since making mods for Morrowind is an absolute nightmare, we'll be using Oblivion instead.
Great.
Besides, I have a much better idea for Morrowind that will upset significantly more of its fanbase. Which means it's time to turn Oblivion into a proper CRPG. Have you ever wondered why the term role-playing game feels so vague and undescriptive? It's almost as if it was invented for something else and not meant to be used with video games. As one guy in my comment section said, technically, any game where you have a role is a role-playing game. Obviously not. The term was invented to differentiate tabletop games like Dungeons & Dragons from more traditional board games. And when you apply it in that context, it suddenly makes a lot more sense. After all, there's not a whole lot of role-playing going on in games like Sorry or Checkers. But when developers started trying to adapt the D&D experience for video games, they brought this term with them, creating the CRPG as a way of distinguishing between the original experience and the subpar imitation. Ultima, Wizardry, Might and Magic, Elder Scrolls Arena, all attempts at recreating this very specific tabletop game. Now I know what you're thinking, Mason, what about JRPGs? That doesn't make any sense for them. Actually, it's the same reason. The very first Japanese role-playing games, Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, were directly inspired by Dungeons & Dragons. But none of this history lesson really matters because we're not trying to make an RPG. We're trying to make a CRPG, albeit very badly. Now, there are a lot of things that we could change about Oblivion to make it more of a true RPG experience, like giving the player more agency in the story or somehow making combat turn-based or some shit. But I actually still want to keep the fundamental, albeit dumb, concepts of Oblivion true to its core, because I want to show you how even superficial changes can drastically alter the feel of a game. And the first thing on our to-do list is to fix this terrible camera. After all, the POV experience was far more synonymous with dungeon crawlers like, you know, the Elder Scrolls. What we want is a camera style that's reminiscent of the de facto perspective for CRPGs, the bird's eye view, or isometric as it was called at the time. Now, isometric is technically a math term. It doesn't actually make sense in a 3D landscape, so I guess I'm just gonna be calling it bird's eye view, and those sounds a lot dumber, because otherwise people get mad at me or something, I don't know. Now, the Oblivion Nexus does actually have a bird's eye view mod. It was initially made at the behest of Juve. You probably know him as the guy who can't leave places. But even though this mod does fit the requirements of being a top-down camera, it doesn't satisfy my unrealistic expectations. After all, most top-down games have a slight angle to them. In 2D games, this would give the world the faux 3D look, and in actual 3D games, it helps accentuate the depth that exists within the game world. When you move the camera to a perfect 90 degrees, however, the environment loses all of that depth and becomes far more difficult to distinguish what's going on. But there is a major reason why the developer of that mod, DDM-Link, coded the camera to be this way. Because as it turns out, we don't actually have any real control over Oblivion's camera. You may not be aware of this, but Oblivion actually has a rather unique coding language that Bethesda developed specifically for the construction set. It's rather rudimentary, and there isn't really a lot you can do to affect the game itself. And that's because it was only designed to control everything within the game. All the actors and interactable objects, as well as lighting and weather. The game itself, however, was written with a much more complex programming language, known as C++. And this was what was used to build the construction kit, as well as the programs, the Control Radiant AI, the Havoc physics engine, and, of course, the camera. But that's actually why Oblivion's script extender is so useful, because this bit of code introduces new commands into Oblivion's proprietary script. This also goes the same for Skyrim as well. However, Oblivion's script extender also wasn't designed to do anything with the camera. Fortunately, however, there is a rather old and hard to find plugin called Camera Commands, which does allow us to override Oblivion's camera code and forcibly place the camera exactly where we want it. Now, to be fair, this doesn't work perfectly. As you may have noticed, the player character is flickering constantly, and unfortunately that's a problem I can't really fix, because even though it looks like the camera is following along with our character, it's actually not. The camera is just moving to the character's current location, and there is a microsecond in between where the character is moving away from the camera. And since the game is now updating both the player's coordinates and the camera coordinates separately, it doesn't really handle that particularly well. But considering this is just some dumb mod that people are gonna acquire for free and play for 5 seconds before they realize it was a terrible idea, I guess that's good enough. Now, when it comes to turning one type of game into something it was never meant to be, there are a lot of problems that immediately arise. For one, we now get a beautiful view of all the half-made geometry in the background. And while a look behind the scenes isn't that big of a deal, it does become a problem when we can't even see our character at all. But fortunately, there is an easy fix for this, as Oblivion's INI lets us increase the clip distance of objects too close to the camera. I was hoping to be able to change this on the fly, depending on whether you're an interior or exterior cell, but fortunately that was impossible. However, that problem is infinitesimally small compared to the next one we need to deal with: Oblivion's wonderful dialogue.
One more coin, and I can get a pair of shoes.
Thank you, kind sir.
No, not that kind of bad dialogue. No matter where our camera is in the world, the second we speak to anybody, we are aggressively thrusted back into first-person mode and zoomed straight into the character's disgusting face. Now, the zoom is actually pretty easy to solve. Just change this one number in the config file and bingo bango, zoom no more. But the camera location is a lot more complicated. After all, it is tied directly to the skeleton of the character itself. And even though you can change its location temporarily, it will just default back as soon as we do anything at all. I could probably prevent that by going through all of the animation files and trying to alter them, but that still would only solve one aspect of this problem, which already has an easier solution. You see, since the camera is attached to our boy's skeleton here, all we need to do is move him. I don't know why it took me so long to think of that. I feel kind of stupid admitting it. Anyway, now that that's done, look at that. We're up in the sky, looking at some random NPC talking to nobody, like they've got a bad case of Hollywood schizophrenia. So in order to fix that, I decided to replace this empty space with a clone. That's right, that man standing right there where you just were isn't you. It's a creepy, lifeless husk wearing your face and clothes. And this is where I've got a little bit of Oblivion trivia for you, because Oblivion doesn't really have a proper way of getting rid of NPCs. I don't know why. So instead, developers will send NPCs to an unused or rarely used cell, which will then automatically reset whenever it's coded to. There is the delete full actor copy function, which would actually work in this situation, but the solution won't always work. For example, if for some reason a second copy is made before the old one could be deleted, which would be every single time we change cells or load a save file. And that means we would very quickly end up with an overwhelming army of creepy copycats. So instead, I wrote a little script that just looks for any NPCs containing this custom spell I made, and then ships them off to the murder room to be, you know, murdered. Unfortunately, that does mean you might run into a copy of yourself every now and again, but don't worry, because they quickly will be whisked away to my Saw-style escape room before you know it. Now that we've got our camera perfected, there are a few more subtle things I want to do to give this game that final oomph to really bring out the CRPG feel. For example, most CRPGs will telegraph who your enemies are and who your allies are using a colorful ring, and that's exactly what I did. Also, I needed a solution to limit the viewing angle for the player, since there's no way for us to know what angle our dude is is actually looking at. Fortunately, this was actually pretty easy though. Just have a script that checks for the angle, and if it goes beyond a certain point, force it back down. Now, there were actually some things that I really wanted to do, but ultimately didn't have time to figure out. For one, movement in this game is atrocious. Instead of being able to just change our character's direction at a whim, we still have to use the mouse ball, and that just does not feel right in a game like this. It would have been cool to incorporate a mouse click to move feature, but I don't think that could happen. Additionally, I intended to let the player change the camera angle on a 45-degree plane. If I do ever get back to this mod, that will likely be the first thing I introduce since, you know, it'd be the easiest. But enough fantasizing, because the things that I did implement still have some major hiccups. For one, the dialogue script that's supposed to plop down our copycat dude just does not work sometimes, and I'm really not sure why. Also, the ring effect that's meant to highlight our enemies doesn't always activate when it should, as the game doesn't seem to always recognize us as the target until we hit them back, even when they've been wailing on us for a while. But fortunately, the script that removes any excess player copies does seem to work rather well, although it's impossible for me to know when it fails since all the copies will be invisible. I guess if one part of town starts to lag like mad, that's probably why. Additionally, any building with a low-hanging second floor will pretty much completely block your view. For some reason, the devs just hadn't anticipated somebody wanted to move the camera into such a bizarre position. God damn it, Todd Howard. And you might as well give up on any dreams of being an archer or a ranged mage, as it'll be practically impossible to hit your target. You might be able to use this mod in tandem with the target lock option that comes with a new third-person mod, but I haven't actually tried that myself, so it might take some finagling at best. However, the biggest problem is probably the crashes. If you try to load a save file that doesn't have exactly this mod initialized previously, it's probably gonna crash. I haven't had any problems creating a new character, or if you load up a save file that already had this mod as it is, it probably will be fine, but I don't know. Nonetheless though, I am quite happy with how this mod turned out. There was a lot more I was able to do than I genuinely expected. At first, I wasn't even entirely certain if I would be able to move the camera at all. The fact that I got that far was quite satisfying. And if after all of this you are still interested in checking out this mod yourself, it's actually available to download right now on the Oblivion Nexus. Just look for the link in the description. And if you do encounter any bugs, feel free to let me know in the discussion section on that page. Try to be as descriptive as possible. I don't know when or if I would be able to get around to fixing them, but it'd still be helpful nonetheless. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and if you're interested in more wacky stuff like this, then hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video.